So in The Dope, you described how Mexican drug trade started long before the 20th century. Can you give a brief history lesson on how that first started? How did a small community of driven production narcotics evolve into a larger scaled operation and organized crime?
Excellent. I'll cut down my 250 page book. Right. Okay. So in very brief, really briefly, there are two drugs that Mexico's always produced. The first is marijuana, which, in all frankness, was basically a soothing thing to smoke, mostly for people who were in prison or in the army. And it became quite popular in the late 19th century as something, basically, it was very difficult to smuggle alcohol into barracks or into prisons. So people instead smuggled marijuana. So it became a kind of prisoner drug and an army drug. However, in 1910, there was the Mexican Revolution, and many people joined the army. So, peak 1914, there were about 250,000 Mexicans in the army, another 200,000 in kind of irregular guerrilla bands, and a lot of them used marijuana uh, as a kind of palliative to smoke when they were bored, but also if they had an injury. It was basically their version of opium or morphine. It was the thing that helped if you had a wound or had an injury. So many of them used it for that. So that's how that kind of took off in Mexico. The other drug that Mexico's produced really from the 1920s onwards is opium, out of which you make morphine and heroin. Um, However, it was mostly initially Mexican Chinese people who started to produce opium, really just for Chinese smokers of opium. It was a really small industry in the kind of 20s, early 30s. But in the late 1930s, what happens is America is cut off from Asia because of the Second World War. And as a result, it can't import any opium or any morphine or any heroin from Asia or from Europe, actually. So as a result, in the late 30s, early 40s, Mexican farmers take over the growing of opium and the producing of heroin for this big US market. And that's really the beginning, kind of 1940 to 1945, when it really gets going.
I've never heard that in my life, but I did hear about the Mexican Chinese history before. So now that kind of ties in a little bit. And I've spent some time throughout, America finding some of the old Chinese opium dens while they're building kind of the railroad system. And
Mm.
so I've had heard of a little bit of the history there. So is that similar to where the Chinese Mexicans kind of come from? Is that area kind of that time frame?
Exactly the same time frame. So basically, I mean, I think our assumption is that America has just been racist towards African Americans and Latinos. However, it started off in the 1880s being very racist towards Chinese immigrants. And in 1882, it kicked Chinese immigrants out of America. Many of them come down to Mexico. Many of them build the railways in Mexico in these kind of desert regions of kind of Baja California, Sonora, Chihuahua, and they end up there and they take their tradition of opium smoking, which I think we think is, I mean, opium smoking has a very bad reputation, like basically doing any opiates. But for many Chinese people, it was like you or I having a whiskey at the end of the day or a glass
Yeah.
of red wine. I mean, it was
Right.
basically a relaxant after a hard day's work. Many of them were not, very few of them were actually addicted. We now think maybe only about 3 or 4% were actually addicted.
Wow. Yeah. I think that's one of those cultural things that we see it differently. But
Mm.
yeah, those have definitely been used for many years. And I've learned a little bit of the history of it. So it's pretty fascinating to hear that in Mexico it was prevalent as well.
Did,
Um,
did you ever did you ever
Please.
go to La Chinesca in Mexicali?
No, I haven't.
That's amazing, man. So Mexicali, if you've ever been there, it's so incredibly hot. So the Chinese built an underground city. So it's this network of opium dens, boarding houses, people's houses. It's this extraordinary network
Yeah.
that still exists away from the heat and also, frankly, away from the border patrol and away from customs.
Yeah, that's the same. If you go to there's a town called Pendleton, Oregon, that actually still has the same exact thing, an underground city that the Chinese built for opium dens, but as well as living conditions and as well as to evade any kind of like detection. And so it's a whole city, exactly the same thing you described, the same in Pendleton, Oregon. You have to check that out sometime.
I'm gonna have to take a note of that. Right. Thank you. Get a tour.
You noted that the early drug production is primarily from a local, medicinal use and whatnot. What factors drove the global to global proportions where the cartels adapted to these changes? Like, what made it go from that to boom, kind of what we see today?
Okay, there's kind of two big booms. The first boom, which is I kind of make the equivalent, it's like an oil boom or something, is marijuana in the 1960s. Basically, up to the 1960s, no one in America smokes weed. Very, very few Mexicans do. A handful of uh, bohemian poets, but really very, very minimal. The 60s, as you know, counterculture, rock and roll, everyone starts smoking weed, and tens of thousands, probably even hundreds of thousands of Americans come down to Mexico and find out that there are a few places that where they're growing weed already, and really encourage Mexican peasants to grow the stuff. So previously, I estimate somewhere between 40 and 50 small villages grew marijuana in 1960. By 1975, we're talking thousands of villages. So basically, there's a huge explosion. The second big explosion, and that I think creates the first kind of wave of, let's say, cartels or organized crime groups.
Right.
The second big explosion is Coke. It's massive, and it massively increases the amount of money that cartels are earning. It probably puts a zero on their earnings. They go from earning about 3 billion to about 30 billion by the end of the 90s. So, I mean, and it's the American Coke addiction. America is in 1999 is taking 70% of the world's Coke, and 95% of that Coke is going through Mexico.
Yeah, it just goes through Mexico. Mexico is not producing it, right? This is still produced in like Colombia and stuff like that, correct?
It's produced in Colombia, but the Colombians come up with this really kind of smart deal. Basically, up to that point, up to about early 90s, the Mexicans are just basically charging $1,000 per kilo of cocaine. However, the Colombians, after the Americans start putting them in jail, don't want to take the risk anymore. So they say to the Mexicans, okay, you take over a kilo of cocaine, we'll pay you not $1,000, but another kilo of cocaine. Now, a kilo of cocaine is worth $25,000. So suddenly the Mexicans are earning 25 times as much money per kilo of cocaine. And that's the change.
And it meets the demand of what America is consuming.
Yep. I mean, that is the real law of Mexican drug production. Mexican produces what America wants, needs, demands.
That's what it's been, and that's how it still is.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, there's very, very little market. Mexico has started to get a market in drugs over the last maybe 20 years, but still things like fentanyl, which are obviously a horrible drug that is causing lots of problems in the United States, there's still a tiny market for that in Mexico.